The airport was buzzing with life. Families rushing to catch their flights, business travelers lost in their phones, and first-time flyers nervously glancing at the departure screens. Among them were Marcus and Jordan Williams, two teenage brothers full of excitement, their energy nearly contagious. Marcus, the older of the two at 18, was always the composed one. His sharp mind and calm demeanor balanced out Jordan's 16-year-old impulsiveness. Jordan, on the other hand, was the kind of person who couldn't sit still. His sneakers tapped against the floor, his hands constantly moving as he spoke. "Bro, Miami is gonna be insane," Jordan grinned, nudging Marcus. "Beaches, parties." Marcus rolled his eyes, adjusting the AirPods in his ears. "We're literally staying at Dad's house. You think he's letting us run wild in Miami?" Jordan smirked. "Maybe if we don't tell him what we're up to." Their father, Richard Williams, was a powerful man, CEO of Airlines. Yet, despite his status, he had always raised them to be humble. No special treatment, no handouts, just discipline, respect, and hard work. As they handed their boarding passes to the agent at Gate B27, Jordan grinned at Marcus. "First-class seats, my guy. Perks of being a Williams." The moment they stepped onto the plane, they felt the shift. Eyes lingered. Passengers stole quick glances before returning to their books, their conversations, their phones. The subtle tension wasn't new. It was the kind of unspoken judgment Marcus and Jordan had felt their whole lives, two black teenagers in a space that didn't seem to expect them. Susan Miller, a senior flight attendant, noticed them immediately. She had been working for Airlines for over a decade. To her, experience had fine-tuned an instinct for trouble. At least, that's what she believed. Her eyes followed Marcus and Jordan as they walked down the first-class aisle, dropping into their seats near the front. She hesitated, frowning slightly. They were young. Too young, she thought, for first class. Susan took a breath, smoothing out the front of her neatly pressed uniform. Maybe they were rich kids. Or maybe they had snuck in. Either way, she would keep an eye on them. The flight was boarding smoothly until Jordan, restless as always, nudged Marcus. "Man, check out this menu. They got lobster rolls. Ain't no way I'm eating plain lobster." Marcus smirked. "Then don't order it." Jordan laughed, tossing the menu onto the seat between them. "Bet they're charging like $50 for." "Excuse me." Both brothers looked up. Susan stood over them, arms crossed, her professional smile tight and forced. "You two need to keep your voices down. Other passengers are trying to settle in." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. Okay. Sorry." Susan didn't move. She eyed them as if waiting for something, an attitude, defiance, an excuse to escalate. Jordan squinted. "Hold up. We weren't even being that loud." Susan's expression hardened. "I need you to lower your voices." "No." Marcus placed a hand on Jordan's arm, a silent warning to drop it. "Got it," Marcus said evenly. Susan lingered for another second before walking away. Jordan huffed under his breath. "What the hell was that?" Marcus exhaled. "Just let it go. I don't see her saying that to anybody else." Marcus had noticed too. He just didn't want to start something before the flight even took off. Minutes later, the last passengers were seated, and the captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing their on-time departure to Miami. Susan was making her final walk down the aisle when she noticed Jordan. His feet were propped up slightly on the edge of his seat. Not on the tray table, not blocking the aisle, just resting on the corner of the plush first-class seat. Her patience snapped. "Young man," she said sharply, "put your feet down. That's extremely disrespectful." Jordan glanced up, confused. "What? You heard me." Jordan raised an eyebrow, sitting up straight. "Lady, I'm sitting in my own seat." Susan's face reddened. First-class passengers are expected to behave with class. If you can't follow simple etiquette, I will have to ask you to move. Marcus sat up, his expression darkening. "Move where?" Susan folded her arms. "To economy." A heavy silence settled around them. Nearby passengers had started watching. Jordan laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, so now we gotta move seats because, what? I was comfortable. Susan's eyes flicked around the cabin. She could feel the attention, but she doubled down. I need you both to move to economy, immediately. No, Marcus said firmly. Susan stiffened. Excuse me. Marcus met her gaze, calm but unwavering. We paid for these seats. We're not moving. Susan's grip on her service tablet tightened. A whisper of doubt crept in. What if they actually belonged here? No. She refused to be second-guessed. She straightened her posture and reached for the call button. That's it. I'm getting security. Jordan let out a disbelieving laugh. You're kidding, right? Susan turned away, signaling to another flight attendant. Within moments, a uniformed officer stepped onto the plane. Is there a problem here? He asked. Susan put on her best, concerned employee face. Yes, officer. These 2 passengers are being disruptive and refusing to comply with flight crew instructions. Jordan's jaw clenched. Marcus took a deep breath. Sir, we're just sitting here. We didn't do anything. The officer looked at Susan, who nodded firmly. That's not what I was told, the officer said, voice flat. You 2 need to come with me. Marcus's heart pounded. He could see passengers watching, some looking away uncomfortably. Others just stared. Jordan, furious, pulled out his phone and hit record. Oh, hell no, he muttered. We're recording this. Susan's face flashed with alarm. Put that away, she snapped. Jordan ignored her, camera rolling. We're being kicked off this flight for nothing, Jordan said, voice shaking with anger. Passengers murmured. The tension was suffocating. The officer sighed, already tired of the scene. Stand up. Now. Marcus looked at his brother. Jordan's fists clenched. They had no choice. As they stood, the whispers grew. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 2 black boys being dragged off a plane. Marcus swallowed the shame rising in his throat. Jordan kept recording. And Susan? She just smoothed her uniform, feeling satisfied. She still didn't realize this moment was about to ruin her life. The airport was colder than it should have been. Marcus and Jordan stood near gate B27, staring at the glossy floor, their fists clenched, hearts pounding. The murmurs from the terminal still rang in their ears. Passengers had watched them get escorted off the plane like criminals. Some had looked away, pretending not to see. Others had whispered to one another. But no one had stopped it. Jordan was still gripping his phone, the recording screen open. He had caught everything. Everything. Bro. His voice was low, tight. I swear to God. Not here, Marcus cut him off. His jaw was clenched so hard it hurt. Not in front of these people. Jordan exhaled sharply, pacing. She kicked us off for nothing. Nothing, Marcus. And everybody just watched. A few airport staff stood nearby, pretending to be busy. A security guard was keeping an eye on them, hands on his belt, just in case. Marcus felt something burn in his chest. Humiliation. Powerlessness. He had felt it before, but never like this. Never so public. Never so blatant. Jordan ran a hand over his face, then looked up at his brother. Call Dad. Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to. He could already hear Richard Williams' voice in his head. You have to be careful in this world. People will judge you before they even know you. But this wasn't judgment. This was wrong. Marcus pulled out his phone, tapped his father's number, and held it to his ear. It rang once, twice. Then, Marcus? You boys landed already. Marcus swallowed. No. Silence. Then, his father's voice sharpened. What happened? Marcus looked at Jordan. His brother's eyes were burning with anger. Then he looked at the Airstar Airlines logo on the wall behind them. And he started talking. Richard Williams sat in his corner office, high above downtown Chicago. The moment he heard the words, "They kicked us off the plane," he stood so fast his chair rolled backward. His sons. His company. Richard listened, his grip tightening around his phone. Marcus explained everything, how the flight attendant had targeted them, how she escalated over nothing, how security treated them like problems that needed removing. Richard's breathing slowed. Not because he was calm, but because his anger was too deep for shouting. He pressed his free hand against the desk, knuckles white. "Are you both okay?" Marcus hesitated. "We're fine." That was a lie. But Richard let it go. "Send me the video," he said. His voice was dangerously even. Jordan, still furious, jumped in. "Dad, we can't just." "Send me the video. Now." A pause. Then the file came through. Richard pressed play. Susan's voice, sharp and patronizing. Jordan's voice, stunned. Marcus's calm refusal. Then the officer's order, low and firm. "Stand up. Now." Richard exhaled slowly, then pressed a button on his office phone. "Get the head of PR in here. Now." Meanwhile, Jordan had already uploaded the video to Twitter. He didn't even think. He just did it. His caption was simple. "Removed from our flight for nothing. This is what it's like flying black. At Airstar Airlines, explain." Within minutes, notifications exploded. 10K views. 50K views. 100K views. People were commenting, retweeting. Some were outraged. Others were skeptical. At Lisa J. _blogger, "This is disgusting. That flight attendant should be fired." At MilesRight 99, "I need to see the full video before jumping to conclusions." At Airstar Official, "We take all complaints seriously. Please send us a DM so we can investigate." Jordan read the responses, his blood boiling. Marcus checked his phone, shaking his head. "Bro, this is huge." Jordan's lips pressed together. "Good." Marcus hesitated. "You know Dad's gonna want to handle this quietly." Jordan scoffed. "Yeah. Well, too late for that." Susan Miller had no idea her name was trending. She had just finished another flight, exhausted but satisfied. She had handled the Miami flight well. She had enforced the rules. She had done her job. When her phone buzzed, she pulled it out lazily. And then she saw the email. Subject: Urgent. Report to Airstar HQ immediately. Susan frowned. She clicked the notification. "Susan, a serious incident regarding your conduct has been brought to our attention. You are required to report to headquarters immediately for an internal review." She blinked. Her stomach twisted. She reread the email. Serious incident? Then her phone buzzed again. A text from a coworker. "Susan, you need to check Twitter. Now." Her fingers trembled as she opened the app. The first thing she saw was her own face. A paused frame from the video. Her standing over the two brothers. Her own voice, cold and sharp, telling them to move to economy. Her breath hitched. She scrolled down and saw the rage pouring in from thousands of people. Her chest tightened. What the hell was happening? At Airstar Airlines headquarters, Richard Williams stood at the window of the conference room, arms crossed. Marcus and Jordan sat at the long mahogany table beside him. A PR executive paced the room. "This is already out of control. We need to make a statement before it gets worse." Richard exhaled through his nose. "I want her in this room." The PR exec hesitated. "Susan." Richard turned. "Yes." Jordan smirked. "Now this is gonna be interesting." The walls of Airstar's HQ seemed to close in as Susan walked through them. She clutched her purse, her mind racing. This was just a misunderstanding. Right. She wasn't racist. Right. She entered the conference room, stopping cold when she saw them. Richard Williams, Marcus and Jordan, all staring at her, waiting. She swallowed hard. For the first time, she wasn't in control. And for the first time, she had to ask herself a question she had never really considered. Did I do this because they were black? Susan's heartbeat pounded in her ears. The air inside the Airstar Airlines headquarters conference room felt thick, heavy. Richard Williams sat at the head of the long mahogany table, expression unreadable. To his right sat Marcus and Jordan, their faces cold and set. Jordan's phone was placed face up on the table, the screen still open on Twitter, where their video had already passed 3 million views. And to Richard's left, Susan sat alone. She could feel their eyes on her. Waiting. Judging. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to keep her breathing even. The door clicked shut behind her. Richard leaned forward, voice steady. "I assume you've seen the video." Susan swallowed hard. "Yes." Silence. Richard tilted his head. "So?" Susan clenched her hands together, keeping her voice measured. "I was enforcing flight regulations. They were being disruptive. My decision was based purely on protocol." Jordan scoffed. "That's bullshit." Susan's eyes flicked to him. "Excuse me." Jordan leaned forward. "You didn't see two disruptive passengers. You saw two black teenagers in first class and assumed we didn't belong there." Susan bristled. "That is absolutely not true." Marcus, who had been quiet until now, spoke. His voice was calm, but cutting. "Then why were we the only ones singled out?" Susan opened her mouth, but no words came. Richard interlaced his fingers, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me, Susan, if my sons had been two white boys, sitting in those same seats, laughing, talking, existing, would you have done the same thing?" Susan froze. Her throat went dry. Her instinct screamed to say, "Yes, of course." But something stopped her. Something she didn't want to face. Her silence stretched. Jordan let out a humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Susan's fingers twitched in her lap. She needed to defend herself. She needed to explain. She wasn't racist. She had worked for Airlines for 10 years. She had served thousands of passengers. She had never seen herself as someone who would do this. But then, like a whisper in the back of her mind, something surfaced. A memory. A moment she hadn't thought about in years. She was 8 years old, sitting in the back seat of her father's old Ford Crown Victoria. They were at a red light, waiting. A black man in a hoodie walked past on the sidewalk. Her mother's hand moved instinctively to the car door lock. Click. Susan had barely noticed it back then. It had been automatic. Normal. She remembered her father exhaling sharply, watching the man walk away through the rearview mirror. "We don't stop in this part of town at night," he had muttered. Susan had just nodded, absorbing it like it was truth. Now, in this conference room, that same feeling sat deep in her gut. She felt exposed. Because for the first time, she wondered, had that memory shaped her? Had that moment, that subtle lesson of fear, of distrust, of assumptions, led her to what she had done to Marcus and Jordan? She squeezed her hands together. "I didn't mean," her voice cracked. She swallowed. "I never wanted." Richard's eyes stayed locked on hers. "But you did it." Silence. Susan felt something she hadn't expected. Shame. Real, deep, twisting shame. Not just because she had gotten caught, but because, for the first time, she had to ask herself a question she had never truly considered. What if I'm not as fair as I always thought I was? Jordan's voice broke the silence. "You know we could sue, right?" Susan's head snapped up. Marcus shot his brother a warning look, but Jordan wasn't backing down. "We could own this airline by next week," Jordan continued. "And you'd never work again." Susan's stomach dropped. Richard tapped his fingers against the table, unfazed. "We don't need a lawsuit to ruin you, Susan." Her breath hitched. He gestured to the phone on the table, where Twitter was still open. "The world already saw what you did." Susan stared at the screen, her own face frozen in the video thumbnail. Her own voice, sharp and patronizing, recorded forever. The flight attendants who hadn't stopped her. The security guard who had treated them like a threat instead of two paying passengers. The passengers who had looked away. Susan suddenly saw the moment from outside herself. And she hated what she saw. She hated the way she had dismissed them. The way she had assumed the worst without even realizing she was doing it. She pressed her palms into her lap, fingers trembling. Finally, she whispered, "I was wrong." Jordan's eyebrows lifted. Marcus just stared at her. Richard, for the first time, leaned back in his chair. "Excuse me." Susan swallowed. "I was wrong. I saw them. And I assumed. Something that wasn't true. She forced herself to look at Marcus and Jordan. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. Her voice was quieter now. I thought I was just following protocol. But I see it now. She swallowed. I see what I did. More silence. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Jordan crossed his arms. And now what? Susan hesitated. Richard leaned forward again, his voice measured. Now you deal with the consequences. Susan nodded, numb. She had no defense. She had no way out. And for the first time, she understood why she didn't deserve one. The internet tore Susan apart. Her name was everywhere. #FireSusanMiller started trending within hours. People found her LinkedIn profile, her old Facebook posts, even pictures from her company events. Her Airstar Airlines headshot was plastered all over news sites, blogs, and social media threads. They called her a racist, a power-hungry flight attendant, a disgrace. Susan sat in her apartment, staring at her phone screen, her stomach twisting. Her email inbox was flooded with messages, some from strangers cursing her out, others from reporters asking for interviews. She had dozens of missed calls. But the one she feared the most was from Airstar Airlines' corporate office. It finally came at 8:42 a.m. At Airstar headquarters, the damage control meeting was in full swing. Richard Williams sat at the head of the long glass table, listening as his executive team argued. This is already a PR disaster, the head of communications said, pacing. If we don't act, it'll only get worse. She's already suspended, another executive added. We need to go further. Richard drummed his fingers against the table, thinking. They all wanted Susan fired. It would be easy. Cut her loose, issue a statement, and move on. But would that change anything? Richard exhaled through his nose. Firing her won't fix this. The room went silent. The PR executive frowned. With all due respect, sir, the public wants blood. If we don't... I don't care what the public wants, Richard cut in. His voice was low but firm. What I care about is fixing the culture that made her think this was okay in the first place. Marcus and Jordan sat in the corner of the room, listening. Jordan crossed his arms. So what, she just keeps her job? Richard glanced at him. No. But we do this my way. He turned to the PR team. Draft the statement. She's coming in today. Susan walked into the building like a woman on death row. Her stomach churned as she stepped onto the executive floor. Every glance from her co-workers felt heavier than usual. Some avoided eye contact. Others just stared. The conference room door was already open. Inside, Richard was seated at the head of the table, waiting. Susan's eyes flicked to the other side. Marcus and Jordan were there too. Her mouth went dry. She slowly took a seat. The silence stretched. Richard finally spoke. Susan. She swallowed. Mr. Williams. Do you know why you're here? Susan's fingers tightened on her lap. I assume I'm being fired. Richard leaned forward. You assume wrong. Susan blinked. Jordan's eyes narrowed. You're kidding. Richard didn't react. He kept his gaze locked on Susan, his expression unreadable. You made a mistake, he said, voice even. A big one. You embarrassed this company. You hurt my sons. You abused your authority. Susan's face burned. Richard exhaled. But I don't believe firing you solves anything. Susan's breath hitched. Marcus spoke for the first time. So what happens to her? Richard turned to Susan. You're going to fix what you broke. She frowned. I don't understand. Richard leaned back. You will publicly apologize. On camera. Not just to my sons, but to every single passenger you've ever mistreated. Susan swallowed hard. He wasn't done. You will also complete mandatory racial bias training, not the 1-hour corporate bullshit. A full program outside of this company, led by professionals who know what the hell they're talking about. Susan felt the weight of the room pressing in. Richard wasn't saving her. He was forcing her to face herself. Susan cleared her throat. And If I refuse, Richard tilted his head. Then your career is over. Jordan leaned forward, arms crossed. Either you do the work, or you disappear. Susan's stomach twisted. She wanted to run. But deep down, she knew this was the right punishment. Because she wasn't a victim. She had done this. To them. To herself. She swallowed and gave a small, shaky nod. I'll do it. Jordan scoffed but said nothing. Marcus watched her, expression unreadable. Richard nodded once. Good. Then let's begin. That afternoon, Airstar Airlines released a statement. We take this incident very seriously. Our priority is to ensure every passenger is treated with fairness and dignity, regardless of race, background, or appearance. Effective immediately, Airstar Airlines will be implementing mandatory racial bias training for all employees, starting with those in leadership positions. Then came the video. Susan sat in front of a plain white wall, looking directly at the camera. Her hands were folded. Her voice was steady, but her shame was visible. My name is Susan Miller, she began. I've been a flight attendant for 10 years. And last week, I let my personal biases influence the way I treated two passengers, Marcus and Jordan Williams. She exhaled. I assumed the worst about them. I didn't see two young men excited for a trip. I saw trouble. And because of that, I humiliated them. I made them feel like they didn't belong. And I was wrong. She hesitated, her throat tightening. I have spent the last few days reflecting on my actions. And I have come to understand something painful. I am not as fair as I always believed myself to be. A pause. I don't expect instant forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am committed to changing. Not because my job depends on it, but because it's the right thing to do. She exhaled. I am sorry. The internet exploded. Marcus and Jordan watched the video in their apartment later that night. Jordan shook his head. Too little, too late. Marcus just sighed. Jordan looked at him. You buying any of this? Marcus leaned back on the couch. I don't know. Silence stretched between them. Then Jordan muttered, She's right about one thing. Marcus glanced at him. What? Jordan exhaled. She doesn't deserve instant forgiveness. Marcus nodded slowly. They weren't ready to forgive her. Maybe they never would be. But at least she was forced to face the truth. And for once, someone like her didn't get to walk away unscathed. 3 months later, the world had moved on. The internet had found new scandals, new outrages, new villains. But for Marcus and Jordan Williams, the memory of that flight never faded. It stayed with them, the way the passengers had looked away, the way Susan's voice had cut through the air, the way security had treated them as a threat instead of customers. They had spent weeks giving interviews, sharing their story, speaking about racial bias in the airline industry. They had received messages from people who had gone through the same thing, people who had never been believed, never had their stories go viral. And they had seen Airstar Airlines change. Because of them. At Airstar Airlines headquarters, a new training session was beginning. Susan Miller sat in the back of the room, notebook in hand. She wasn't there as a flight attendant anymore. She had resigned a month earlier, not because she was forced out, but because she realized she couldn't go back to pretending nothing had changed. Now, she was training new hires, teaching them about racial bias, about subconscious assumptions, about how a single moment of judgment could ruin someone's life. She had spent the last 3 months learning, unlearning, and confronting herself. And for the first time, she didn't feel defensive. She felt responsible. She had been part of the problem. And now she was trying, really trying, to be part of the solution. Was she forgiven? She didn't know. Did she deserve to be? She wasn't sure. But changing wasn't about forgiveness. It was about doing better, even when no one was watching. Marcus and Jordan stood at the Miami airport, waiting for their bags. They were back. Back to the same airport where their trip had originally been derailed. But this time, it was different. No lingering humiliation. No anger burning in their chests. Just the quiet realization that they had turned their worst experience into something bigger than themselves. Jordan adjusted his backpack. You think she really changed? Marcus exhaled. I think she's trying. Jordan gave a small smirk. Yeah, I guess that's a start. They didn't have to forgive Susan. They didn't have to feel sorry for her. But they had won. They had forced someone like her to see them. And in the end, that mattered. That changed things. Not just for them, but for everyone who came after them. Final scene. A flight attendant on an Airstar Airlines flight walks down the aisle. She sees two young black boys laughing, talking, enjoying their trip. For a split second, she hesitates. Then she reminds herself of the new training, of the Marcus and Jordan case. And instead of assuming the worst, she smiles and keeps walking, because now she knows better.